When I was a young adult, I would have a dream again and again. And in that dream, my father would die, and I would try to give a eulogy at his funeral, and someone would stop me. Now, there were good reasons why I had these dreams, not only subconscious or unconscious ones, but real ones in life. One is my father always expected disaster. He was talking about mortality every day since the age of 40 years old. He didn't die till he was 78. Second of all, I grew up in a traditional community of Syrian Jews, and they did not allow women to speak at funerals. But I, an only child, devoted to my father, was committed to eulogizing him. Nothing, I decided, would stop me. And so, in 2005, when sadly my father passed, after a brief illness of about a month, we were planning the funeral, and it would be at a Syrian synagogue, and we invited one of the more liberal, no one in this room would consider this rabbi liberal, but in that community, he was considered liberal, right? One of the more liberal rabbis to lead his funeral. And this liberal rabbi, who I will not name at the moment, told me I could speak. And I was surprised and grateful. So when the day happened, it happened to be pouring out. Were you there, Lisa? No, you were in Israel. And my husband gave the first eulogy, and he introduced me, and he said, now my wife, Hyman Esses' only child, will give the second eulogy. And the rabbi of the synagogue, who was not the rabbi leading the funeral, got up, went up to the front of the room and said, no lady will speak in my synagogue. So I started wailing, like wailing probably louder than I've ever wailed in my life, saying, but he's my father, he's my father. The whole congregation was still. The rabbi of the synagogue went to the door in the corner of the room, opened it, and said, and pointed outside, and he said, here, you can talk from here. So I stood up, and I went outside, and my 85-year-old Moroccan grandmother, who didn't know a word of English, followed me, and so did some cousins and one of my best friends, and they held an umbrella over my head, and I spoke. Now, half the people there were delighted that I was speaking, and the other half thought it was absolutely outrageous. I was not allowed to truly enter the congregation on that day. I did not really belong. I was literally kept outside of the room of people who came to mourn, of all the people who came to mourn and honor my father. Every Shavuot, we read a book called Ruth, one of my favorite books in the Torah, in the Tanakh, about a remarkable woman named Ruth. And she is a Moabite. And what's remarkable about her is that being a Moabite, we're told in Deuteronomy that no Moabite or Ammonite shall enter the congregation of God. So it says in Deuteronomy 23:4, Lo yavo Ammoni u'ma'avid b'kal Adonai. As I said, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. Gam dor asiri. None of their descendants, even unto the 10th generation, lo yavo lahem, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. B'kal Adonai ad olam. And why? This is pretty severe, right? So why? So the Torah continues, on account that they did not greet you with food and with water on the way at your going out from Egypt. And because they hired against you Bil'am, who was a non-Israelite prophet at large, son of Beor, from Petor and Aram of the two rivers, to curse you. So given this Torahitic law, it's remarkable that the character of Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of King David, and thus the foremother of the messianic, the redemptive line. It's from her that redemption is said to ultimately emerge. How does she do this? How does the ultimate outsider become one of the most important characters in the entire biblical corpus? Well, what she does is she undoes history. She does a tikkun on the past, a repair of history, and does the very opposite of what the Moabites did. Listen to her story. It begins with Naomi. Actually, it begins with Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Elimelech, during a famine, takes his wife Naomi and his two sons, Machlon and Chilion, and I'll never forget my Bible professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary told me that we should translate those names as Siki and Dedi. Machlon, Machala, and Chilion, right? Someone who's over. So Elimelech takes his family, and during a famine, and they settle in Moab. So given the portrait of Moab in the Bible, that's the last place they're supposed to go to. And in quick succession, all the men die. Elimelech dies, Machlon, in like half a verse, Machlon and Chilion die, but they had married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, and they had settled in Moab. They had lived there 10 years without having children, so it's another barrenness story. And so suddenly, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are left alone, right? Naomi, a grieving, childless woman. And she hears that in her hometown, Bethlehem, which literally means the house of bread, that God had visited her people to give them food. So it's like, okay, I'm going back home. And Ruth and Orpah want to go with her. And she says, no, I have nothing for you. I have no sons. I have no more sons to give you. I have nothing for you. Go back to your family's homes. You can't come with me. And they insist and they cry. And she says, no. And Orpah goes home. And what does Ruth do? Virut davkaba. And Ruth attached herself to Naomi. She made herself sticky, right? Naomi literally stopped speaking to her, and Ruth went. So they went on this journey, and they arrived in Bethlehem. And no one recognized Naomi because she was so grief-stricken and bitter. And she said to the townspeople, when they said, could this be Naomi? She said, don't call me Naomi anymore. My name is Mara. I am the bitter one. So what Ruth did is the very opposite of what her ancestors, the Moabites, did to Naomi's ancestors, right, the Israelites. Instead of abandoning an Israelite in the land of Moab, as she is making her way back to her homeland, she accompanies her, connects to her, cares for her. Consider her famous speech. Ruth told her, do not urge me to abandon you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. V'tomer Ruth al titka'i bi, la'ozvech lashuv me'acharayach, ki el asher telchi elech, uva'asher talini alin. Amech ami ve'elohayach Elohai, ba'asher tamuti amut, v'sham ekaver, ko ya'aseh Adonai li, v'cho yosiv ki hamavet yafri beini uvenech. Ruth throws her lot in with Naomi's, and eventually she also procures food for her. She nurtures Naomi on every level. Her ancestors in Moab were basically saying to the Israelites, we don't recognize you in your hour of need, and we will not help you. You will remain forever outside of our circle of concern. In turn, the Torah says, these people remain outsiders forever. They will stand outside the congregation of God. So back to my story. I was excluded from my home congregation, but unlike Ruth, I did not become someone at the center of the community I was excluded from. I decided to defy my community's expectations and became the worst thing possible, a liberal rabbi. Way too far afield of their comfort zone. They had no idea how to connect to me, how to make sense of me. For them, it was as if I had switched genders. It's impossible for me to truly belong in the community I come from. Nevertheless, I still think some repair of history, of family lineage, of Jewish lineage is possible. I remain interested in what it means to repair history, to do the opposite so that healing can occur, as Ruth did. So what might it mean to do the opposite? This year, Romemu had the privilege to celebrate 12 adult bar mitzvahs. 12 people who either didn't have a bar mitzvah, bat or bar mitzvah, or had a meaningless bar or bat mitzvah, and decided to study for a year and a half and come up to the Torah, chant and speak and lead prayers. I mean, it was an inspiring sight to behold. Recently we had 3 of these ceremonies in succession, right? So this past week, so they're finally over. We have 4 altogether this year. And I know some people in this room have done them in the past, right? In previous cohorts. And as we were doing post-game analysis, someone in the cohort, Paul Ullman, said, doing an adult bar mitzvah is the opposite of trauma. I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I've been reading The Body Keeps the Score. You know that book by Bessel van der Kolk, right? And trauma is something that imprints itself on our mind and body in a way that can't be processed, can't be digested. And so it keeps repeating itself in an effort to kind of work itself through. And also there's no language, like that person who's been through that horrifying experience or a series of experiences can't speak the language of what happened to them. And it's also it's an experience that leaves one disconnected and lonely. So bar mitzvah is like a powerful, like every person in the cohort felt sort of so present and so joyous and so connected that they felt, and when Paul said this, it resonated for many of the people in the cohort, like this is the opposite of trauma, right? Sort of really taking Torah and owning it and saying, I belong to this community. I belong to a community. I belong to a people. This is one of the reasons I decided to become a rabbi. Having radically not fit into my community, I thought somehow that taking Judaism and owning it and becoming a rabbi would really kind of heal that disconnect. But what I realized is that Judaism doesn't give meaning magically. You really have to sort of actively own it and put yourself in it and say, like, I belong, right? It doesn't happen by itself. It did happen for every single person in that bar mitzvah cohort. What Ruth shows us is that through this principle, through this practice of dveikut, of attaching oneself day in, day out to relationships, to community, to people, of connecting beyond ourselves, that's the way to repair history. That's the way to repair the wounds and disconnects of the past. By stepping in rather than expecting others to show us we belong, rather than waiting for others to allow us to enter, to give us permission, instead, we dare enter the congregation, step in and take hold, attach ourselves to something greater than we are. We cast our fate with a people's destiny. This is the shining example of Ruth. This is the luminous model offered by the 12 people who came before this community and took hold of Torah and dared to say that they belong, that they are at the center. As it turns out, Ruth, the story of Ruth, becomes the model of conversion later on for the rabbis in the Talmud. She actually becomes the model to other people who sort of as if saying, like, you think you don't belong here, but you also can belong here, right? So again, it's the opposite of what happened with the Moabites, right? The opposite of exclusion, it's inclusion. As for me, I realized after my father's funeral that the place the rabbi placed me was a place where the Kohanim, the priests, stand during a funeral when they can't enter. So that made me think, maybe what he did that day was more of a sign of inclusion than either he or I realized. Shabbat Shalom.